Well, welcome back to the Fractal Sovereignty podcast. As you may notice, we've got a couple of new additions. We've got Belinda Noakes, who's on Team Humm, and we've got Jean Russell from Holochain and the Commons. So today we're going to talk about what the Commons actually is and how it all works and where it all came from. So welcome, guys, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you.
Jean, do you just want to talk a little bit about yourself and how you got to the point of the Commons being here now? Like just a bit of background and maybe why you're working on the Commons.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the background for me has to do with my work on thrivability for the last decade. And that comes from an interest actually in human flourishing. Like, what is it for an individual to flourish? And then, actually, that always has to happen in a context of a group. And so how do we bring groups together in a way that creates flourishing? So I've written a book on thrivability, Breaking Through to a World That Works, that talks about what are the innovations in our culture that is enabling thriving. And then a book on cultivating flows. So what are emergent organizational structures and processes that help to create thriving? And so from that, an interest in the commons, not obvious, comes from a sense of like the collective sharing that we have together. And whether that's like a traditional sense of a commons, like a land-based commons where we're all sharing a piece of property and using it together, or more of a modern commons, like a code commons or an intellectual commons where there's a group of knowledge that we're co-creating together. And so what are the processes by which we can compensate people for their contribution, by which we can share that property in a way that feels like it's reciprocally closed. And by that I mean, like, you feel good about your contribution and I feel good about receiving it, because at the very root in our human nature is a concern about that sense of reciprocity, that we feel like what I contributed I'm acknowledged for, and what I get back is kind of my due. So what is that process, whether it's a physical sharing or intellectual sharing? So my big picture is this thrivability, and that has to do with the sense of how we are sharing together. My friend Robin Chase wrote a book called Peers Inc. She's the founder or the co-founder of Zipcar, which was one of the first car sharing applications. And so she wrote a book about what does it mean to bring some of the corporate mindset together with community in order to provide this structure that allows for sharing at scale. And so I'm very interested in like how we take the old model of sharing economy, which seems to be corporatized, and transform it into something that's deeply peer-to-peer, which is a piece of how Holochain comes into the mix, because it's a technology really designed for peer-to-peer. So maybe that's enough. And you can ask another question.
Yeah. So would you say that like your work on thrivability is part of like, and the commons, like that thread is like creating like the regenerative sort of ecosystem versus the kind of, and then kind of like, you know, like these new models and the patterns. I'm just trying to sort of get that common thread there. So the thrivability and the commons, it's sort of, you know, people have a misconception that like corporations sort of lose out, or the business aspect loses out, but it's more about how we can all co-create together and create new patterns of doing things. So talk a little bit more about that kind of thrivability link and the kind of those threads that you see connecting those.
Yes. I'm working on a concept that I call the exuberance economy. And I call it that because so many of the technologies that we're developing are actually about subsidizing use so that more of us can participate. So some of us can afford to pay for us to be present. And a piece of that has to do with how maybe you can contribute your time and I can contribute my money, and some third person contributes their resource, some type of asset such as web hosting or energy. And we can all feel like we've been acknowledged for our contribution to that whole. So I'm very interested in that, like how that creates more than one might, hi kitty, how that creates more than one might expect, right? Like it seems that there's more in the space when we're together than there is if we're each individually discrete. Does that make any sense? Do you want me to give an example?
Yeah, sure.
It does. Yeah, an example would be helpful.
So if we look at something like Trello, which is a freemium model, 80% of the people who are using that are not actually paying for it. 20% are paying for some extra piece of the service that allows the other 80% to be participating in the service. And those 80% might not participate if they weren't otherwise enabled. But because they are the marketing funnel, instead of spending money on marketing, Trello is able to just enable free service. Facebook is also doing this, but the way that Facebook is doing it is by selling your data, which doesn't feel good, right? So that's not a clean reciprocal relationship. Where Trello, you feel like, yeah, it's okay. Some percentage of the people are paying, and if I can afford it, I'm happy to do so. But it's fine that like some of us are not paying. So where are the models that enable that kind of interaction, where those of us who can afford to pay help to cover those of us who cannot, because we're each contributing in some way that's meaningful to the group.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where deep wealth and interoperability would come into it, right? So rather than just simply looking at, financial models and ways in which financial means are exchanged, it comes back to other currencies which are asset-backed, which are other forms of wealth, which which you're just talking about. Am I on the right page there?
Yeah, I mean, asset-backed is one dimension of that. So there's a currency there that means that if you can't get money out of the currency, you could get money out of the asset that allows it to be stabilized, which is slightly different than the kind of multi-dimensional. So if we were to talk about triple bottom line, we would say, well, there's the money, and then there's the social impact and the environmental impact. But what if we consider like 9 or 10 different dimensions of that? What if we consider time to be one of those elements? What if we consider your knowledge to be one of those elements? And if you've come from kind of a nonprofit background, this is really common thinking, because you have people who are giving their services pro bono in order to offer up something to the organization for a social purpose. And so when you have that social purpose goal, it's easier for everybody to bring whatever they have available, whether that's their time, their money, their talent, their knowledge, or their home, right? They might give up their space or their office space in order to help make something more accessible for the whole. So how can each of those contributions be acknowledged instead of only the one dimension of money being acknowledged?
Cat on the
That was
keyboard.
like cat on
So, Jean, I'm interested in can you help me understand a bit more about the scope of what this initiative that you're calling the Commons Engine could be? So, in terms of like the breadth of what you're aiming to cover and develop.
Yes. I get this sort of like hee look on my face, because what I'm trying to do is create something, and this is part of why the engine is in the title, has to do with, I think of it in 3 different phases. And if you look at our website, this is fairly clear. There's a doing it together of like finding groups to partner with that we can really take through the process. So for example, working with Just One Organics, which is doing regenerative agriculture. And so how do we design a currency for them that really serves regenerative agriculture for the community that they're engaged in? and going deep with them as if we are part of their organization in order to help them develop the economy for their organization. We take what we learn from them and applications that we develop with them, and then we process it through a group, so a cohort of people who are all interested in regenerative agriculture, and we go, oh, what about this actually is a pattern, not unique to them, but also practiced by other people? And then how do we, in that group, kind of work on a co-learning what works and what doesn't work, so that we can package up into a do-it-yourself version, something that's more broadly applicable. Oh, you're interested in regenerative agriculture, which also has a lot of actual alignment with energy issues, because they're both things that are temporary. Right? They're like, food is available and then it's not available, energy is available but it's not available, so they have some commonality. So packaging things up into a do-it-yourself version, whether that's a technology or the process, that enables people who are in a similar space to develop it also. So there's this process by which go deep with somebody, learn what works, practice with a group, refine that, test it out, discover the patterns, and then create the pattern that allows people to individually customize for their bioregion or for their local economy, something that fits. So that's part of the engine metaphor that's in our process, is growing that up so that it can keep scaling. But not by
Thank you.
up, this is a scaling out.
Thank you. It's helpful to understand that those three ways of engaging are to some extent kind of sequential, right? And so I assume that after you've cranked the engine for regenerative agriculture, that then you have other, then you move on to different domains. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. So for example, Farananda is most interested in regenerative agriculture, where I'm a little bit more interested in the intellectual space. So what happens with code or recipes or 3D like makerspace patterns, how do those things end up in a commons by which we can all be sharing and growing together? Yeah, so we have multiple domains. And then there's also this other dimension, which has to do with bioregion, where, for example, we've started conversations with groups in Australia because they share a bioregion with, like, how do these projects complement and interact with each other in a way that they could co-create.
Well, that sounds pretty interesting. Especially in my area where I'm just mining all the water from the aquifers. And so there's a few people getting around that and create new ways of doing, commerce with agriculture, and it's, where permaculture was born. So you have a lot of that, like people that way inclined, and kind of new ways to build homes that are natural, and like the whole learning and training of these new skills. But it feels like there's a gap in between. There's a lot of people that want to do it, but there's not like a fair remuneration. So what you find is a lot of people sort of working for free, or not being fairly compensated, or trying to make ends meet. So if there was like a way in which there was more of a cooperation between these different pieces of the puzzle, people were able to start working together and sharing skills, or creating these things that work for everyone. It seems like it would be a pretty good fit with those things there, especially with the connection with the technology too. So that's pretty interesting to me.
Yeah.
So for the people that don't actually know, what is the commons itself? Like, we keep using this term, the commons. Like, so someone's never heard of it. What is it?
I breathe a little bit deeply there, because there's such a wide range of what somebody might consider the commons. And so there's a collection of people by which if I say market and commons, they get uncomfortable because they're like, the commons is something that we share together and that shouldn't be capitalized upon. Where other people are going to be quite comfortable with saying, well, most of the sharing economy is a commons. And I think there's another piece that I want to add in here, which has to do with the tragedy of the commons, because there's been some sense that some story about the need to capitalize because otherwise the commons will be corrupted by individual interests taking too much advantage of something that's a shared resource. And so I was deeply inspired when Elinor Ostrom's work came out about the tragedy of the commons, and that actually people are very good about negotiating in small groups what the way of sharing a commons is so that the commons resource is not completely devoured. So that gave me hope about like, what is the group process? What is the governance by which we make agreements about sharing some shared resource so that no one individual takes too much advantage of something that's in the shared space.
And
I would look at somebody like David Bollier, who's got some great work on what is the commons.
And some of those patterns around decision making, is that part of the scope of the commons engine as well?
Certainly governance is going to need to be a piece of that pattern. And I don't think that I have all the answers on how that's going to work. That's going to so much depend on the groups that come together and what are the terms for the spaces. Because if it's not co-created by the people engaged, then it's going to feel like it's an outside imposition. And so there's a dance there between like being a steward of what the commons can be in a way that provides some basic resources around how do we govern, and then a conversation with the people who are living and operating in that space that allows them to customize for the commons that they are relating to. And so like a car sharing service is a different kind of commons than a fishery. Mm-hmm. Where like, oh, if we overfish, then suddenly there's no more fish for us to be sharing together.
Yeah.
So the risks in them also affect the way that we are governing each other and ourselves in that space.
So it's basically, in a way, it won't be like creating new communities or networks, but empowering the already existing ones to have the tools to self-govern and not externalize governance.
Yes. That's certainly going to be my preference. We don't like outside governance very much, I find.
Yeah, I don't think many people really do. Well, I mean, at least in the Holochain community.
But let me add more specifically to that, that one of the things that Elinor Ostrom talks about is the governance in terms of polycentricity. And so it's like the people who are closest to the thing that needs to be governed ought to have the say in how it is governed. And so coming in as a facilitator to that space, it's about allowing the voices to be heard about what their concerns are so that we can create patterns and agreements that work for people, not about coming from like, here's our global pattern on how that all ought to be and imposing that. So we want to bring together the wisdom from many different practices and offer them, but for any given commons, the specifics need to be worked out for the people who are relating to them.
And how do you find this, how do you see finding the fine balance between the extremely centralized decision making by the government, or you name it, or like the corporate model at one side, and at the other side, the completely distributed way of where you can end up having a lot of discussions without really taking decisions. Mm-hmm. This fine balance.
It is a balance, right? Because I think of things like, I'm really enamored with projects like Inspiral, which do a ton of customizing. So everything that Inspiral is relating to is a customized agreement. And it's an evolving, like it's a living agreement. So it can continue to be customized. But I don't find it all that scalable. And then there's another project, and I talk about this in my Cultivating Flows book, Sensorica, which is kind of governance by pattern. And so it assumes everybody kind of same, and thus we have one global pattern that we're going to use for how we're going to do things together. And I find that a little bit lacking the customization part. And so I think there's going to be a dance about, can we be federated in how this happens, in which like bioregions are coming to agreements, or we have living documents that are up for renewal as they evolve, as the group evolves. So how do we dance between that like fine customization that allows us each to be living in the moment versus the pattern that allows us to be scalable at a broad level? And I don't know that our society has finished figuring that out.
Yeah.
We have some good processes to be building from.
Yeah, because it's not one size fits all. And at the other side, some organic way to create membrane around certain network or common is very necessary, because we see it nowadays with social media, what is happening. We have those situations where the most vocal people are the ones who basically have very little to do or have the knowledge about certain topic. And it's very interesting to see how that develop, how we would have some organic membrane around certain ideas, so you could facilitate proper conversations without just a few taking over.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be wildly different depending on the commons that we're talking about. So if we're saying car sharing as a commons, as a really P2P activity, instead of using something like Lyft or Uber in the middle, like there's enough of a muscle built by Lyft and Uber as a corporation that people have a sense of what kind of things to agree to. And so it won't be that much refinement on top of those. Where when we talk about like energy as a commons, we're so used to that being in a corporate sphere that we're not used to having to negotiate, oh, maybe you should turn off your air conditioner so I can have a hot shower. We're so not ready for that kind of... but we might be able to develop some tools that will help us, right? Like, me running my appliances at these particular hours actually drain the network in a way that's not useful. So if I have a smart meter, I can do a better job of not consuming energy at peak hours and time my showers to times that are better suited for the network to manage the load. But a bunch of that is about making feedback loops visible, right? So that we can all self-manage the whole.
And education.
Yes.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Jean, will the Commons Engine project initiative include any of the technology pieces, do you think? Or is it purely going to operate at the level of that look again?
I am in the process of working on that. And if I can get all the agreements in place that I need to have, my plan is that there's enough of a base technology that we can have features built on top of it that fit, let's say, if we're talking about an energy project, that fit, customizing a currency for an energy project. But what I would really like to have in there is that the like white labeled version that goes for that business that wants that feature then ends up spinning back into the commons, in which over time we're developing more and more features that can be fed in. And so at least if you're a simple application, you can add in some of these features. And then as you develop larger user base, you may want to customize into your own branding and continue to evolve features, so that we can have commons over here that's broad in everybody, but then, oh, this particular commons has been very successful and it's customized and branded and whatever in a way that's like financially viable for them. while continuing to feed back into the engine. So that's my scheming. I have not been able to make all the agreements line up quite yet, but that's what I'm working towards.
Lovely.
What can you give us some kind of indication on the tools that will be able to be shared by the people that are getting involved in the commons? I read in an article that you guys are going to be developing like a suite of tools that can be used by everyone. Is that technology based, or is that governance based, or is it all of the above, or that you're still figuring it out? What's
I would totally say we are still figuring it out. And I have some intention around some of the first pieces. Clearly, we need governance. Obviously, we'll be working on currency and multiple forms of currency, whether that's more reputation-based or more like asset-based mutual credit currencies. So those will definitely be in the mix of things that we want to see developed. And it so depends on which communities come to us and what they're interested in, because we want to co-develop these things with others. There is this piece that I'm working on, which may or may not fit in the commons, which has to do with my vision of like business models for Holochain. And how do we create ones that are not advertising based? How do we create ones that are not super extractive? And so there's an article that I've put out there called A Happy Vision for a Haps Future, which talks about how do we create the modules that allow for things like the freemium model that I was talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. What is the payment model? What is the marketing funnel that allows somebody as a developer to put together these little modules into a business that's a profitable application? And so some of that may end up in the commons, but some of it may not. But that's one of my personal projects as opposed to something that's just and only within the commons engine.
Right, because that was going to be my next question actually, was about, because I saw you wrote online one time about the advertising model and how it's time to create a new way of doing things. And then you've also got, there's different funding models and like to the commons, or which may or may not be a part of it. So could you speak a little bit about like the advertising specifically and how you feel that needs to shift?
Yeah.
Or is it to wait for the article to be released?
No, that article is already, at least the first pass of it is out there. My publisher is interested in continuing that, but one of my mentors is also interested in developing it, and she blogs for HBR. So I don't know where the articles are going to end up yet. That comes out of going to the Decentralized Web Summit, where there was concerns expressed about how advertising has shaped the internet as we know it. And some of those concerns were expressed by people like Tim Berners-Lee from the web, or Vint Cerf from the internet, or Mitchell Baker from Mozilla. But many others who were in the room concerned that like, oh, we're creating this decentralized web, but isn't that kind of in a way what we did when we did the web to begin with, or what we tried to do when we created the internet itself? And so how do we know that this next version is not going to be corrupted in the same way? How do we know that's not going to become centralized as well? And so that's drove my effort to find ways that Holochain would be able to have applications that could be profitable businesses while serving the commons, or excuse me, at least serving the community in a way that didn't feel extractive. So I was like, well, what already works? What are the models that are out on the web that are not advertising based, that don't feel extractive, that are not about surveillance? And that's why I was looking at things like the freemium model. And when I looked at freemium, I also noticed things like Patreon and TipJar. And I realized that we have let go of our attachment between the cost of production for a good and who pays how much. Like, we used to think it took this much to produce a good. I divide that by the number of units sold, add a little margin for profit, and that's how much I charge people. And we don't do that anymore. And part of that is the magic of the internet, that we're able to create software that has a certain cost of production, and the like margin that's of cost on top of that for another 1,000 or 100,000 users is fairly minimal. So part of it is the economics of the internet itself. But part of it is also, I think, a cultural evolution in which we are not as attached to everybody has to pay their fair share. We're actually happy to have some of us pay for others to participate, and we can feel aligned and congruent with each other on that. So it's okay if I pay, and I think this is actually rooted in things like in the US, NPR and PBS, which were public radio, public television, where some people were paying various amounts in order to have this public good. And we all recognize the value of the public good. And so I think that's a little bit of the root of this larger vision of like, it's okay for some of us to be paying for all of us to have access to a benefit. And so where else is that happening? And what else can we do to facilitate those models being available on the web? And then how do we reduce the ones that are like, and we're paying to surveil you, right? Like that's where it feels bad, is when it's like, I am now the product. And so, but with Trello and other freemium models, you don't have to feel that way. So how do we create more of those? And how do I make a pattern of that that allows people to build more of it on Holo?
And so the business models and the funding models, which is connected to that and Holochain, do you have any kind of personal insights as to what direction? Like I know that, for example, with Patreon, you know, and advertisers controlling content and journalism, and you've talked about this as well.
Yep.
You have these influencers controlling what people can and can't support and all of this kind of thing. But then within Patreon, you have MasterCard or Visa behind the scenes, you know, in control of that. So then, you know, you have these new business models with Holochain and mutual credit currencies and all of that kind of thing, and no advertising. How does that look for, you know, people that want to get involved in, you know, like say like an investment platform or a, you know, like all of these kind of things, which will have to have these funding mix-ins and, you know, new ways of doing things, which won't be able to be corrupted by these kind of things. How does that all mesh in together?
So two things come up for me there. One has to do with, I think of tokenization as an ability to play with time. And so if you think instead of like tokenization as get rich quick speculation, and instead think of it as I'm getting a gift certificate to a store that hasn't started yet, or the way that you would think about a CSA, I'm paying now so the farmer can plant his seeds so that I can later partake in the harvest. Then we're not creating kind of VC environment that's expecting the 10x returns that are what drives so much of the internet. So if we're each participating in projects that we believe in and using a token to like, I'm going to invest in that now so that it can grow later, it's like taking Kickstarter and the crowdfunding movement to a whole new level. So that's one dimension of like, hey, actually this ICO stuff, which has been used way too much for extraction and speculation, the model could be used for a lot more CSA style investment in projects that we believe in order to help them have the funding to move to the next level of growth without having to be overly extractive. So that's one. And then the second one has to do with microtransactions, which is one of the beautiful things about Holo, is the way that it enables microtransaction, right? We went and what's the simplest thing that you could possibly do that you could keep track of? And we had to do that because we were doing web hosting. And so it was just this simple double entry accounting, which fits smoothly with mutual credit. So if all I'm having to keep track of is the accounting balance between you and I'm +1, you're -1, vice versa, you're +2, I'm -2. It's so simple and easy to keep track of that kind of balance. And I think this could be really useful in things like journalism. So I would love to see a model come up where, for example, we say, oh, I'm super excited about this particular journalist. Like, I personally think that Cory Doctorow is like fantastic, and I love Boing Boing. But Cory's paying attention to a bunch of other people. And so if some of what I contribute to him, let's say I give him 10, he has to give forward to the people that he benefits from, then it can re-trickle into the system. Like you can design that trickle into the way that it works in a way that that has to be forwarded. So even when you have somebody who's at the super popular level, they have to credit the people that they are getting information from. And because it's microtransactions, that can happen at a very small scale and aggregate. And so I think we'll end up getting some more of the quality that surfaces, because those people who tend to be the influencers are actually paying attention to a layer of people who are providing a lot of quality, who may not like express it in a way that allows them to be as visible, but provide a value. And so those are some of the things that I think would enable different modes to show up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, it does. So I've started to get pretty interested in how we can build into systems and structures growth dynamics that are sustainable and aren't extractive, right? I love the idea of how do you codify paying it forward? How do you actually make that something that is not only required but also genuinely of benefit for both the individual that's doing it and the greater community? And so that could work in different contexts differently. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of paying it forward. I worked in the philanthropic space for many years and just think that that tends to be a model that's really powerful for people, because if you contribute to somebody and then they're able to grow value out of your contribution, then saying, you know, this is a revolving loan. I don't expect the money back. I expect it to give it, that you give it to the next person so that they can start theirs. It's so empowering to each person in a line to feel like they are now helping the next person to grow theirs. Just so sweet.
So just on that, I'm a little bit familiar with Kiva, for example. Yeah. I mean, do you see that something like Kiva could directly translate into the Holochain ecosystem, or how might something like Kiva be able to be different within this kind of environment, given some of the base capabilities in the platform?
I mean, if I was to design Kiva on Holochain, I would do what I just said, the paying it forward. So I'm willing to give $25 to somebody. What they have to do is, after some set period of time, contribute $25, and it could be 12 and 12, like they have to contribute to 2 people, but half the amount. And then we continue to hear back the stories, because what people really want is the sense of meaning and connection. So I want to hear that the person that I contributed had a good experience, was able to have a lovely holiday with their child, provide food on the table, right? The quality of their life improved. And then what I want is, I don't want that money back. I'm not as interested in getting it back. Like, mostly that's throwaway money to me. What I want to hear is that somebody else got helped. And so who does that person choose? Why did they choose them? What happens to the third person? And then I get to be part of a chain of transformation, right? That continues to scale out.
And the whole chain can be made more explicit and visible because of the ability to trace.
Yes.
Nice.
And you're tapping into something much greater, the kind of like abundance. And I personally had some experience of volunteering for certain non-profit where everything was basically financed by donations. That was just in a few years, that just exploded, and so much, and nobody was paying anything. Everything was just on basis of donation and goodwill, and it definitely worked by all means.
Yeah, I feel like we are in such a sense of an identity crisis as a global population, driven by advertising telling us we're not enough until we buy something. And actually, the antidote to that is to be a contribution to something.
It is about participation in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you look back, those huge multinationals and the Googles and the Facebooks, they had a very hard time to find a business model. The first years, they had all those billions of people, actually the attention of those people, but they didn't know how to monetize it. And basically, attention is one of the greatest gifts in this whole universe, the attention that we give to things, to people, to ideas.
Yeah.
That's how we're empowering them. And that was the way, the business model they found. So maybe it's time for a completely new business model, how to use the attention of people for possibly better than, just selling them stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because that is a way to participate. It's fundamentally, everybody wants to be part of something, and everybody wants to, I don't know, buy Nikes or something.
Let it not be everybody buy Nikes. I contributed to my community. I made somebody's life better.
Yeah.
So this would be sorry, Belinda, you go.
Well, it's just, I'm sitting here thinking about there's something really interesting happening here, but where a technology innovation or a recombination of a few things in a different way that allows for this traceability and visibility of a series of transactions, right? Can actually help us to harness the power of story to inspire people and trigger emotional responses in people, which then creates a kind of a feedback loop that can create motivation to stay involved, get involved. Yeah. I'm starting to get a better sense of how technology features and functions can, how we can use that to create behavioral change or to encourage behavioral change.
Yeah.
And ultimately human to human interaction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's simple.
There is a thing that we have organizations that provide the story of feedback that allow us to know, oh, that shirt that you bought from this country far, far away actually, didn't create good quality of life for the person who was making it. And so we've started to understand that connection, but we don't have a way to very clearly sense it and know it. And so creating currencies that say this money was never used for child labor is super powerful, that we could have that choice. And only in a world in which we have digital technology could we have money like that, because the cash money that we have has this super fungible quality in which you have no idea if the money in your wallet was used to hurt animals, to harm the environment, for social injustice. Like, you have no idea. Oh, that was actually used to buy off some government official. You just don't know. But in the digital technology world, we would be able to see, how was this currency flowing before it got to me? And I can see some of how it flows after I've touched it. And that feels like it's deeply empowering to me as somebody who's creating a meaningful life, to create a sense of integrity and connection with those things that have touched me. And so we've had an itch, and now we're trying to create the technology that supports that ability.
Yeah.
It's very powerful. I see many often people mistakenly looking in digital currencies, something like they're looking for anonymity, but actually I think that the power is of the transparency, precisely. not so much the anonymity, because as you mentioned, the US dollar or whatever, euros are perfectly anonymous, but there is no transparency in it at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, I like to look at those extra flows of value that you can see, like through these positive feedback loops, through these regenerative patterns, in a way in which it can connect us with how we actually want to live. So what I'm finding is like, you know, like you walk in, I eat out a lot. So I go to cafes, I work in cafes and all this kind of thing. And I don't particularly want to ask the waiter every time, like where did this like come from? Like how is it grown? What kind of chemicals, or is it organic? Is it like, you know, like there's so many different layers to it that we're cut off from. Like just even in that agricultural transaction line, like I would like to support the mum and pop shop that does everything ethically and feeds, you know, their local community and that kind of thing. But that information's not really that accessible for me. So that flow of value that I'm like participating in is not necessarily going to where I think it is. Like I could be going to a local organic restaurant, but then they're importing all their ingredients from overseas or something like that to make it organic, or like it's still part of a monocrop. So it's like, I feel like by making visible these extra forms of value, people can create that ecosystem for themselves that they would actually like to participate in. Because I just feel like just on that mini level there, on the microcosm, my money would be getting siphoned off into all these different places that I wouldn't know about and I wouldn't agree with, while I'm sitting here thinking, well, how great am I because I'm supporting a local business that's organic or something like this. Yeah, so that's where my head's going with like how I can participate in a sharing economy, how that can be moved on through you know, the gifting, or through that flow continuing on, and through the positive feedback loops created by the extra parts of the value that we see. That's really exciting.
Yeah. I want to point out that when we had small economies, this was easier because you could actually go to your store and you knew that was, you know, Bob's farm, and get that sense of direct connection. I mean, I'm even old enough to have like gone to a local farmer and left a quarter in his porch and picked up the eggs that were in the cooler, right? Like we had that connection. And then this whole thing about scale, it became like the government is managing that for us. And it's just such a like thing through all the layers to the government managing it and then kind of coming back down to have performance indicators. Well, these are grade A eggs, so you know they're good. You don't have to know that they're from Bob's farm. Now we're able to like bring that back to a local layer. And so, you know, we tried to like up the standard by growing it to a larger scale, but then we lost the sense of connection. And so the technology, I hope, is allowing us to bring it back to a human connection while allowing us to have a global standard. So I'm interested to see how those things interact.
Yeah, isn't it peer-to-peer, the essence of peer-to-peer, precisely that, bringing basically the farmer's market back away from Walmarts and the centralized monsters that basically you don't know who stands behind, and where does your eggs come from, or where your tomatoes come from.
Most of us, me included, don't even really understand what a particular certification actually means.
Yeah. It's perhaps not even on government, perhaps it's just on corporate level, most cases. Or
I find myself being curious about timelines, Jean. So can you see from where we are today? Do you have a sense of how long it might take to work through the first phase with this first agricultural group in depth, and then move to the collaborative piece?
There's a yes and a no to that answer. And so the yes has to do with, well, I can estimate, how is Holo and Holochain developing? And then at what point there's enough stability there that the next tier is developed. And okay, so I kind of have a sense of the timeline for Just One Organics. And how does that play out? So yes, there's a way in which I can see that timeline. And there's another way in which I can't see it. And it has to do with the way there's this convergence and this sweetness, where when you're not operating out of a competitive space, people are so willing to pitch in. And the way that people who haven't been involved with us have been priming themselves for this, like there's just a readiness in the world for it. And so people have done a lot of the thinking that would get to this point. And so I might be able to say, 2 years from now, this exists. But there's also a way in which I wouldn't be surprised if things moved faster because of that sweetness between projects and the way that collectively we've been thinking this way. And so we're so ready for it that it might come faster. So if I would to say, particular project, I can see 2 years out from now. I know 5 years out, I can see us having very good generalized patterns that allow for commons across very many product lines. But I'm also continue to be surprised by how things keep folding time, because people have been so primed and ready and are so anxious to have the technology. And yeah, there feels like there's a convergent moment that's not far off.
Reminds me of the video that Matthew Studi recommended. I watched it yesterday, called Spiraling Upwards, I think it's called.
Upward spirals.
Upward spirals, yeah. It was that's when you're sort of talking about these moments in time folding, or like how people are ready for it. That seed is planted, and then people would love to contribute, and then it's in a non-competitive nature and more co-creative. Like we just had a call yesterday with another founder on Holochain. It was really fantastic, and we're learning to open up and share and help each other. And so like these spiraling upward moments can help kick in, like what you're doing with Just One Organics. That'll help provide a foundation for some other tools. You'll learn some stuff. Other people will jump on board, take it, move with it. It'll start to open up through that.
Yes. And so when you talk about timelines, it's like I can only take responsibility for what I can control. And so I have to project some long timeline for that in order to feel like I'm speaking from integrity about what I can promise that's within my reach. But I continue to be inspired by the things that are folding, as you said, on the upward spiral of all across the planet. I keep meeting people who have been working towards these ends and are so ready for this to come into being. And I just see them grabbing it and running with it. And I'm sure that people will beat us to many of the things that we were trying to do because they're so ready for it. If we don't do it fast enough, they'll jump in ahead of us. And more power to them, right? Like it's not a competitive environment, it's a co-creative environment. So
yeah,
Be a pretty good place to leave it. Did you guys have any more questions, or did you want to talk about anything else, Jean, while we have you on?
Oh, maybe just a quick question, because I know that you are now in Germany, in Berlin, and many other people from blockchain developers are there. Can you maybe share something? What's going on and what you're up to?
Sure. So the Holochain Core team tries to meet once a quarter. And the last time they gathered, it was in Canada, and they gathered with the Holo Core team. So the team that's developing holo.host. And I'm on the application team, building stuff on top of Holo and Holochain. And so this meeting was with between the HAPS team and the Holochain Core. And it's just so sweet to like all be in the same space, because we're used to like this being on Zoom calls with each other, because we have team in Australia and Europe and Canada and the US and a little bit in South America. Like we're so globally dispersed. And so the rich conversation that happens in the space of like getting to know people because you went out to dinner with them, not just getting on to write some code. There's a quickening that happens in that space of coherence together, and the things that we're able to process by having that live dialogue. Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah, we just had this conversation in our internal Slack, the Humm team.
Yeah.
Like, three of us here are from Humm, so that there is something else. There's this extra quality of coming together, and yeah, I'm in Europe, and Belinda and Nick are in Australia. We have people in the US and
Dominican as well.
yeah, so
Yeah. Mm.
together now and then.
That feels like a lovely place to stop, and so that you can go enjoy some more time with your team, Jean.
One more question, if I can get it in.
Yeah.
So India and Turkey and China are really exploding in the Holochain community. Just from your travels and being involved in the core team, and like, where do you see some little pockets of nuggets that you feel are kind of, primed for what we've been talking about? Like, where do you see as kind of, on these edges that are ready to kind of come through? Do you have any kind of insight?
You've talked about the hunger. So where are people most hungry in your experience?
I have other teammates that I feel like they've tapped into Turkey, that there's energy there, and a couple teammates, India and Korea, Philippines, that there's a bunch of stuff there. Me personally, there's a lot of resonance in Australia. And I've been connecting with Australians for years. I was in Australia in 2011, keynoting for a conference. And so I already had connections down there. And the developers that I work with are in Australia. And so I'm getting to see a lot of the juice coming out of that space. And I don't know if that's just me. Like, I was already working with social entrepreneurs that were in Australia. And then adding the dev element just makes that even sweeter. So that's a big spot for me.
Yeah, interesting. Because the Philippines, 80% of the people there don't have a bank account. In Australia, our government has introduced a bill that's forcing apps and technology companies to build backdoors into all of the technology. So that's a really big point of pain for us over here. So I'm especially hoping that, we can co-create with Holochain to help heal that wound, because it digs pretty deep. And that's just one of the things going on over here. So.
Yep, I hear you.
Yeah. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, Jean. And if you next to come into Australia, you're always more than welcome to stop by and say hello. The Holochain community in Australia is vibrant, and we're organising a meetup in March actually to get together. So we'd love to have you over, and it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast and getting to know you a bit better. And I wish that we can fix it too.
Really great to meet you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Lovely to meet you all. Share some time. I hope we have more.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Ciao, Jean. Ciao, guys.
All right.
Bye, everyone.